Within half an hour of Willoughby's leaving the house, Elinor was again called downstairs by the sound of another carriage. Eager to save her mother from every unnecessary moment's horrible suspense, she ran immediately into the hall and reached the outward door just in time to receive and support her as she entered it. Mrs. Dashwood, whose terror as they drew near the house had produced almost the conviction of Marianne's being no more, had no voice to inquire after her, no voice even for Elinor. But she, waiting neither for salutation nor inquiry, instantly gave the joyful relief. Supported into the drawing-room between her daughter and her friend, and there shedding tears of joy, though still unable to speak, Mrs. Dashwood embraced Elinor again and again, turning from her at intervals to press Colonel Brandon's hand. Marianne continued to mend every day, and the brilliant cheerfulness of Mrs. Dashwood's looks and spirits proved her to be, as she repeatedly declared herself, one of the happiest women in the world. Marianne was restored to her, and in her recovery she had yet another source of joy unthought of by Elinor. It was thus imparted to her as soon as any opportunity of private conference between them occurred. "At last we are alone. My Elinor, you do not yet know all of my happiness. Colonel Brandon loves Marianne. He has told me so himself." Her daughter, feeling by turns both pleased and pained, surprised and not surprised, was all silent attention. "He opened his whole heart to me yesterday as we travelled. He has loved her, my Elinor, ever since the first moment of seeing her." Marianne's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow, and it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove, within 4 days, into Mrs. Palmer's dressing-room. When there, at her own particular request, Colonel Brandon was invited to visit her. His emotion in entering the room, in seeing her altered looks, and in receiving the pale hand which she immediately held out to him, was such as in Elinor's conjecture must arise from something more than his affection for Marianne. At the end of another day or two, Marianne growing visibly stronger every 12 hours, Mrs. Dashwood, urged equally by her own and her daughter's wishes, began to talk of removing to Barton. The day of separation and departure arrived, and Marianne, after taking so particular and lengthened a leave of Mrs. Jennings, and bidding Colonel Brandon farewell with the cordiality of a friend, was carefully assisted by him into the carriage. Mrs. Dashwood and Elinor then followed. Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise, and Colonel Brandon immediately afterwards took his solitary way to Delaford. The Dashwoods were 2 days on the road, and Marianne bore her journey on both without essential fatigue. Everything in that most zealous affection, that most solicitous care could do to render her comfortable, was the office of each watchful companion, and each found their reward in her bodily ease and her calmness of spirits. As they approached Barton, she grew silent and thoughtful, and turning away her face from their notice, sat earnestly gazing through the window. She said little, but every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, and though a sigh sometimes escaped her, it never passed away without the atonement of a smile. The next morning produced no abatement in these happy symptoms. "When the weather is settled, and I have recovered my strength," said she, "we will take long walks together every day. I know we shall be happy. I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean never to be later in rising than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading." Elinor, however, remembered that her promise to Willoughby was yet unfulfilled, and she feared she had that to communicate which might again unsettle the mind of Marianne. Willing therefore to delay the evil hour, she resolved to wait till her sister's health were more secure, before she appointed it. But the resolution was made only to be broken. Marianne had been 2 or 3 days at home before the weather was fine enough for an invalid like herself to venture out. Marianne, leaning on Elinor's arm, was authorized to walk as long as she could without fatigue in the lane before the house. The sisters set out, and they had advanced only so far beyond the house as to admit a full view of the hill, the important hill behind. When pausing with her eyes turned towards it, Marianne calmly said, "There, on that projecting mound, there I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby." Her voice sunk with the word, but presently reviving, she added, "I am thankful to find that I can look with so little pain on the spot. Shall we ever talk on that subject, Elinor?" Elinor tenderly invited her to be open.